Hi, everyone, and welcome to this event on the power of women's leadership in crisis, where we'll be focusing on the climate crisis and how diverse women's voices are essential to tackle it. I am Faeeza Vaid. I'm the executive director of a national charity called the Muslim Women's Network UK, and I'm also a member of the steering board of the Centenary Action Group, a coalition campaigning to remove the barriers to women's political representation. CAG supports greater women's political participation and leadership and an end to violence and abuse of women in politics and public life. They also have targeted efforts to address economic inequalities that prevent women engaging in politics and decision making. So I'm really excited to hear today from women working to address these barriers in the climate change space specifically. Experience tells us that diverse women and girls' leadership supports effective and inclusive action to emergencies. In communities and policy discussions around the globe, women and girls are bringing forward effective initiatives to tackle the climate crisis, particularly women most affected by climate change in the global south. We'll be asking, how are women leaders responding to the current crisis? What are the frameworks that support equal participation in the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change? And I'll be referring to that as UNFCCC process. How can we continue tackling the barriers that remain for women, especially those affected by climate change and young women? And how can we allow those groups to participate equally? We'll also ask, how is the UK using its COP Presidency to address gender inequality and climate change, including implementing the Gender Action Plan? And if I'm okay to introduce Hindou. Hindou, are you with us? There you are. Hi, Hindou. Hindou is the coordinator of the Association of Peul Women and this is a hard word to pronounce, I have to say.
It's Indigenous
Peoples of Chad. She was also the co-director of the World Indigenous Peoples Initiative and Pavilion at COP 21, COP 22, and 23. So you've been around and have a lot of experience in this area, I know. She's currently an expert on the adaptation and mitigation of Indigenous peoples to climate change and has served on a range of UN advisory committees and panels. And you're also currently a friend of COP26. So my question to you, Hindou, is why do you think it is essential that women participate equally in climate change negotiations and policy making? And in particular, why should we focus on Indigenous women and women from the global south? Thanks, Hindou.
Thank you very much, Faeeza, and hi everyone. It's really a great pleasure to be with you and today talking about women's place in the climate change. It can be in the negotiation, it can be in the ground. It is very important to understand that women have a big role to play, and they always play this role. They can be in front or they can be just behind, but they always play this role. So I will share with you the example of how as my person, as woman and as Indigenous woman and as a woman from the global south, I have like all those box checking, and coming to the climate negotiation is completely like a different world. So Indigenous women are the front line of climate change. That's everywhere. My sisters from Sami or from Amazon, and my sisters from all Africa, Sahel regions, or Asia, or Australia, we are all the front line of climate change. But when we start coming from to the climate negotiation, I started 10 years ago. And imagine like being a young woman, young Indigenous woman, young Black woman, and coming to the climate negotiations. My first day got so frustrated, because I'm seeing that people running everywhere, but ignoring that there is someone there, ignoring that there is a person, a human being that is there. Because all what they're thinking about is how they can be in one room, how they can discuss, how they can negotiate as a formatted machine So, I mean, I call them just like robots, you know, like not a human being as individuals with eyes and brains. So then I said like, no, maybe it's not my place. I'm not going to come back there. And then I found other indigenous women who come to the same negotiations, but who was struggling and then saying, if we do not join our voices, we cannot be heard. So we need to be there. Imagine you are here to understand that. I discussed with my sisters from Uganda, Margaret, that I will never forget. 10 years ago, she was a parliamentarian, but she just like say, listen, Hindou, if you are not here, you cannot see it. And imagine the hundred and thousand of women who are at the community level, who are not gotten this chance, who do not get consult to this negotiation at all. So you need to be there to represent them voice and to tell them the realities. So it's encouraged me to come back to the climate negotiations. And today, I know that she is completely right. We need to be there physically. We need to present our voices and we need to discuss. So when I started to come to these climate negotiations, I didn't miss any of intersessional or any of COP meeting. And people are telling me, why are you always going there? I'm like, yes, I have to be there, because if you miss the intersessional meeting, you will not understand what will going on in the COP. And when you miss the COP, it's going to be the same. So it is the continuity and it is the strategy from the state to see how they can exclude, especially if you are women and from observer group. So that's made me, when I become the co-chair of the International Indigenous Peoples Forum on Climate Change, it's helped me to make the voice as a woman, using it as a positive part. I give you the examples. When we get to the COP at the Paris and we start negotiating, then many of the states, and especially I can name them without shaming them, European Union say like, no, we cannot talk about indigenous people rights in this climate negotiation. And I'm like, if we do not talk about the rights, that cannot work at all. And we got, I'm going to name also, to the women ministerial meetings. And I'm happy that my sister Bridget is there. So women ministerial meeting breakfast. And I approach the ministers there and talk to them about how the things are going, how we are getting marginalized and excluded. And you know, all those women come in solidarity. They say, listen, we are going to talk them. Come and see us after this meeting. And after this meeting, immediately it's make a magic. Then it's changed completely. And then they start coming and listening to us. And at that time, I understood you can be a woman, but if you come in solidarity, you can change the game. But you can be a woman. If you are not in the different level, you cannot change. So we got a ministerial woman who help an indigenous woman. And then that's fill the gap to make the voice of the entire community and people to be listening in these climate negotiations. So just to these examples, I end by one another example of how including women can make a change. At the international level, this is a big game. At the national and local level, this is the most important part also. The women, and especially indigenous women, are forgotten completely because we are in patriarchal decision making always. And men are the one who can sit and decide on behalf of the entire community without taking into consideration the 53% of the women that have the voices. And that's completely the wrong way. So what we did, in my organization, and as also in my community, we are patriarchal work way. So we went to the communities and we start talking to the man first. We tell them how you think about the climate change and women role. Because during the dry season, when you are not there, you are in the city looking for the job, the 2-3 months you are leaving them home, they are alone and fighting on them own. So what do you think about discussing with them and seeing how we can support them? And the next day, they make the job for us, just asking the woman to come to the meeting without us doing the job. And then we start discussing about the serious issues. The anecdote behind, they just like come say like, oh, you come and make revolution in our women. But the movement start. And when the movement start, the woman take the lead and they can make the change, but with a lot of challenge.
Thanks so much, Hindou. I mean, I'm hearing such important messages from you around representation, about being at the table, and how women need to work in solidarity at all the different levels. And I love that last example. It was brilliant. It was brilliant. So thank you so much. Okay, our next speaker is Bridget Burns, who is a feminist environmental activist. I love that title, and the director of WEDO. For several years, she has been particularly focused on integrating gender equality and women from the Global South to be heard into decisions and outcomes of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. Bridget also serves as the co-focal point of the Women and Gender constituency. So I guess my opening question to you, Bridget, is what frameworks are in place to support women's equal participation and leadership? How did these come about? I'm really interested to know how you've managed to establish them, and then maybe some examples of continuing support that WEDO and others provide.
Thank you so much. It's such an honor to be here with all of you. It's an honor to speak after my sister Hindou, who is always spreading revolutionary change wherever she goes. And also just to be with folks who've joined this call, especially in these times of ongoing crisis. And I just always want to take a moment to wish everyone good spirit, good health, and joy in wherever you can find it these days. My name's Bridget. I use she, her pronouns. I'm originally from the Bronx, but I'm based in Brooklyn on unceded Lenape territory. And I've been working with the Women's Environment Development Organization for 10 years now. And WEDO is a 30-year-old organization, always working at this intersection of women's rights, environment, and sustainable development. And we've been actively engaging in the climate change negotiations since around 2007. And I myself, since around 2009, with the Copenhagen talks. And I really hear Hindou's piece on the need to kind of be at every meeting to really understand the process, which is both a truism as well as a challenge, and something that causes injustice to who can actually effectively participate in these meetings. Our goals as WEDO in engaging in the climate negotiations have always been twofold. One is to address the gender blind nature of the outcomes under the UNFCCC at that time. And then the second was to increase the participation of women, particularly from the Global South, at all levels of leadership, including grassroots and Indigenous women's participation. And when we started working in this space, some of the primary strategies included co-founding alongside some other leading feminist and gender organizations, the Women and Gender constituency of the UNFCCC, which for any of you who are going to be engaging in COP for the first time, I'll put information in the chat on how you can get connected to the Women and Gender constituency. And we also launched what's called the Women Delegates Fund. So I wanted to lay a little bit briefly the landscape of participation, women's participation at the UNFCCC, to give you a snapshot of what that looks like. The average participation of women across all national delegations, so delegating negotiating bodies, has increased from 30% in 2008 to 39% in 2019. And during COPs, the heads of delegation were at the low rate of 15% in 2008 and have increased to 21% in 2019. But that has actually fluctuated across the board. Women make up less than 30% of board members to the Green Climate Fund, and all of this varies widely depending on region, with lower rates of participation of women in many least developed countries. So in 2009, WEDO launched the Women Delegates Fund, specifically aimed at supporting the travel, training, and leadership of women from the Global South to be part of their national delegations. The WDF has sponsored 378 trips to the climate negotiation sessions for 143 women. And I mention that because, as Hindou said, again, it's been a commitment to supporting the consistent participation of women, not just to one meeting or one COP, but over the course of 5 years to both intersessionals and COPs so that they can build leadership in their delegations. We've also trained over 500 women through on-site trainings and night schools prior to each of the COPs and negotiating sessions. So in just the 2 minutes that I have left, I wanted to give you some good and bad news and what we need next. So the good news is that there's more and more studies and findings that indicate that nations with higher proportions of women in parliaments and in decision-making are more prone to ratify environmental treaties, have greater tendencies to create protected lands. We see women gaining power across the board in the UNFCCC, as seen by some of the participation rates that we've seen there. And several networks exist and mentorship initiatives have been launched, including the SUPSTA chairs last year, SUPSTA being one of the bodies of the UNFCCC. And as Hindou said, this understanding that if we're going to really build power in these processes, we need to build networks and build solidarity to do so. We know the UNFCCC has a gender action plan now. It's squarely recognized women's leadership and gender equality. And while in 2008, as mentioned, there was only one reference to gender equality in the decisions of the UNFCCC, we now have more than 80, including foundational language in the Paris Agreement. The bad news is that women seem to be gaining power in spaces with less power. There are less, when we see that women's participation as heads of delegations drop at COPs, at the big conference meetings where decisions are taken. On boards and bodies in relation to science, technology, and finance, we have less women's participation. We've even measured how often women speak in meetings such as the Green Climate Fund and found that when it was just the board members, that men accounted for 93.2% of the time spoken. So there's ways in which we measure the quality of participation as well. The current rate of change, we would really only reach gender balance by 2040. There's not enough attention to intersectionality, women in all their diversity, including LGBTQI folks, gender nonconforming people, people living with disabilities, and the same issues that challenge participation of many further exacerbate gender inequality. So access to information, language justice, disability justice, and the reality that our global visa ecosystem really upholds white supremacy, and it poses huge challenges to the participation of folks from the global South. So I think we need true inclusion. As one of my Indigenous siblings said earlier this year, recognition without action is a death sentence. There's a trend in all of these spaces towards tokenism. And as Hindou has pointed out in the fight for the recognition of the voices and the rights of Indigenous peoples, we can't just sit by with recognition. We want real leadership and access in these processes. And we need real investment in feminist organizing and governments to really come forward with climate finance pledges that show investment in these activities, as well as in frontline feminist organizing as well. So I'll leave it at that.
Thanks so much, Bridget. I mean, I'm hearing that the need for diversity is now, but not just now. It was probably needed centuries ago. But thank you so much. And you know, it's really great to hear about the Women's Delegate Fund and the difference that makes. And I think the bad news is a reminder of the work that still needs to be done. So thank you for being so candid about that too. I'm now going to introduce our next speaker. Meera Ghani is a policy coordinator at Ecolis and a previous delegate to the UN climate negotiations for the Pakistan government. She is a facilitator, trainer, and a coach, and holds 2 master's degrees. Meera's focus is on economic, racial, gender, and climate change. So I'm sure she's going to include lots of intersectionality in her discussion. Thank you, Meera, for joining us.
Thank you so much, and I am so grateful to be here and to be speaking on the same panel as my sisters Hindou and Bridget. Yeah, it's years of work together that we've been doing that lead to statistics, the great positive increases in numbers and participation that Bridget mentioned. My pronouns are she, her, and like Faeeza said, I am from Pakistan and I was on the Pakistan delegation. And I think after the positive interventions of both my sisters, I think for me, I just wanted to highlight some of the challenges of being on a delegation, being on a small delegation, being a woman of color in the negotiation spaces, being a queer woman of color in negotiation spaces, and also how what Hindou alluded to earlier about how the negotiation spaces are created and how the emphasis is on rigorous meetings, long hours, and exhausting schedules. And for small delegations, like for example, the Pakistan delegation that I was with for 5 years, we were 5 people each time. And it was very difficult to follow all the different streams of conversations that were happening. And they weren't just formal meetings where observers could enter, but there were informal meetings that we had to be running between. And it was difficult. And then also as a woman of color, it was a difficult space to be in because of the power dynamics that exist. So patriarchy, as Bridget mentioned, is upheld within these spaces. And so is dominant white supremacy culture. And that's why there's always this push for urgency, efficiency, decision-making has to be a certain way, everything has to be written down. So we are always negotiating commas and full stops and what word should go where. And it makes for a difficult space to be in if you aren't in the decision-making seats and don't have the decision-making power. And then also just the negotiations themselves. A lot, I've been in those spaces with various hats. So I've seen it how it is as an observer and as a delegate. And I see the difference because as people who are passionate about climate justice and passionate about the cause and ensuring that we leave a safer and equitable and cleaner world for future generations, you go into the negotiations and often come out disillusioned because a lot of the conversations between states and governments are not so much about climate science and the policies and the need to safeguard the future and now, because climate breakdown is happening now in many countries where we are seeing severe impacts. It ends up being conversations and negotiations about trade, about bilateral give and take, and who countries should be allying with and who not, and how you can use diplomacy to bring others on, on your side. So it's a very different kind of animal than what maybe outsiders, those who are not involved in the process, may understand them to be. And then even as observers or as delegates, there is a hierarchy of how you can enter those spaces and how much information you have access to. There are some negotiations that take place between only a handful of national delegations, and some delegations are deliberately kept out. It's the same with observers, where only a certain amount of observers have access, and others are deliberately kept out. And this has been an ongoing issue where civil society has been asking for access to a lot of these spaces and meetings, and which consistently is denied depending on who the COP presidency is. And then while talking about information and knowledge, within the UN negotiations, especially within the UNFCCC, information is the currency. It's gold, and that's what's traded. So if you don't have access to the right people or the right kind of information, even if you're attending all the meetings, you're kind of in the periphery because you're not really getting what the inside track is and what the deals are being made between states. And it also causes a strange kind of situation where because there is such a power dynamic, it's difficult to go into these spaces and really stand in your truth and speak to your truth, and also to call out some of the toxic culture that exists. And I know I wasn't meant to speak on this, but in 2017, I actually did a piece on how the UN spaces, the sexual harassment that goes on there, and just following up from the Me Too movement of how this plays out within the UN negotiations. So for me personally, it's been something that I've been a part of for over 10 years, wearing different kinds of hats. But it's a space that unfortunately felt limiting because of all these challenges. And I ended up actually exiting that space and moving towards more community grassroots work. And that's what I do at Ecolis, where I still work on policy issues, but my main objective is to ensure a space within these spaces or within EU policy spaces for local solutions and community initiatives to be recognized, to be resourced, because I truly believe that people at the local level understand their needs, understand their context, and have the solutions to deal with the issues. And while I understand climate being a transversal, transnational issue requires international agreements and national level agreements, I think the solutions that happen at the local level are innovative, meet the needs of the communities, and are something that actually need to be recognized and given more space. And it's the same thing. And by local, I mean local indigenous solutions, traditions, and practices.
Thank you so much, Mira. I mean, I've learned so much just from the examples that you've given, and I think it's really important for women to understand, you know, the dynamics that you spoke about, you know, in these spaces, and how, you know, those power dynamics can have an impact on the negotiations themselves. And it's great that you've managed to at least call out some of the stuff with your own work as well. And I'm sure much more needs to be done too. Again, just a reminder to everyone, if you have any questions for any of the speakers, feel free to put it in the chat and we'll come to it shortly. Thank you, Mira, again. Our next speaker is Salka Sigurdardottir. Salka is the head of cross-cutting UNFCCC issues in the UK COP26 team. She leads the UK Gender and Climate team and has worked on international issues for the UK government since 2015. Her other achievements include setting up a youth movement for UN Women Iceland and working as a journalist. So, Salka, how is the UK planning to use its COP26 presidency to support diverse women's leadership in climate change and to make sure that the processes this year are even more inclusive than ever?
Thank you very much for the introduction, Faeeza. And I've been a feminist and a gender activist my whole life, and I really do mean it when I say it's such a pleasure to be here having conversation with you today, especially with such an inspiring set of leaders like Hindou and Mira and Bridget. You're the people we all need to learn from, and you've been in these spaces for so long. As a manager, I've always believed that diversity can create an unbeatable advantage by expanding the amount of information the team can access. An inclusive team is likely to outperform, and I feel like this also applies to the collective fight to tackle climate change. And we really should embrace the inclusion of diverse perspectives as a strength, especially given the crisis that is COVID. We're going to need more and more innovative solutions if we have to tackle climate change effectively, and that difference really is the source of creativity. And we're more likely to find good solutions if those most affected by the crisis are able to participate in solving it and ensure diverse women can be agents of change. Now, why does the UK government care about this topic? I mean, our great speakers today have covered that women and girls are more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change as a result of structural inequalities, discrimination, and socioeconomic barriers. I don't need to convince anyone here of that. And championing women's roles as decision makers, educators, and climate leaders is essential if we are to deliver effective and long-term solutions. And as such, we really must prioritize gender responsive climate action and finance in governments. And equally, we must look at broad, transformational and intersectional inclusivity. And I'm really pleased to hear how many people mention intersectionality today. And I do also want to dwell on that a bit, because existing inequalities exacerbate the impact of climate change, especially for those facing multiple exclusions based on their characteristics, including women and girls, people with disabilities, youth, Indigenous peoples, people of colour, LGBT people, and others whose views are often most marginalised on so many fronts. And this can create overlapping systems of disadvantage. And we need to ensure all those voices are included in leadership and action, while acknowledging that some experience multiple layers of marginalisation that we cannot be neutral to. And we as policymakers shouldn't be afraid to talk about these layers of discrimination and not be afraid to admit that we do need to do more. And UNFCCC climate work recognises the intersection of different groups in some aspects. For example, the Local Communities and Indigenous Peoples Platform Work Plan talks about mainstreaming gender considerations across activities. And similarly, the Gender Action Plan agreed at COP25 recognises the need to highlight the solutions of local communities and Indigenous women. And I do want to talk a little bit about the UNFCCC Gender Action Plan I just mentioned. And I know Bridget touched on this much better than I can, so I'm not going to go over the detail of the plan itself. But I do see the plan as a real stepping stone in gender and climate work. The UK is fully committed to not just implementing the Gender Action Plan, but also using our presidency role to encourage other international partners to do the same. And I also want to encourage everyone to consider how they can work with grassroots women's organisations in designing those solutions. Now, the UK has a strong track record of delivering gender responsive climate action, but more can be done. I'm going to talk you through some of the examples that I'm particularly proud of. The UK has supported women's empowerment and leadership within the clean energy sector. This includes through investing in women's skills and expertise development, higher education, work placements, and employment opportunities, both domestically and internationally. And for example, the UK supports the Transforming Energy Access Programme's Off-Grid Talent Initiative, which has so far enabled 180 placements for young Africans in 23 clean energy access businesses in Kenya, Nigeria, and Uganda, with 53% of these placements being for women. And specific policies and targets have been established in our sectors, as for example, outlining the offshore wind sector deal. And we've supported initiatives like Power for Women to enhance leadership in the energy sector. The UK has also worked to build women and girls' climate resilience through investment in more inclusive, core and shock responsive social protection. Through the Better Assistance in Crisis and Gender Responsive Social Protection programmes, we're providing technical assistance and expertise to support partners on responding to climate risks and the differential needs of women and girls in the COVID-19 response and recovery. And through the UK-funded Climate Ambition Support Alliance, or sometimes known as CASA, we're supporting the ECBI Women's Mentoring Initiative, with CASA aiming to strengthen the capacity of developing countries to engage within the international climate negotiations and try and level the playing field between men and women, which many here have touched on. We also know that educating girls is one of the most cost-effective, high-impact ways for every nation on Earth to fight climate change. And that's why we've made girls and women's empowerment and achieving gender equality a top priority, including by ensuring that all girls globally receive 12 years of education. And this is a critical long-term investment for addressing the future of the climate crisis. Now, as you can see, gender and women's leadership is a top priority for the UK government, both through a bespoke initiative, but also through a COP26 vision. And these are just a few examples. There's also links to the work of Anne-Marie Trevelyan as the UK International Champion on Adaptation and Resilience for COP26, who is equally a strong advocate for understanding the vital links between gender and climate, both in terms of disproportionate impacts and the roles as agents of change. We know, however, there's definitely more that we can do and other countries can do. For example, by further mainstreaming a gender responsive and inclusive approach across climate policies and planning of COP, building on the momentum of work we've already started, and addressing gaps in the provision of and access to gender responsive finance, and strengthening women's leadership, decision-making and participation in climate action, and collecting data and building the evidence base on the differentiated impacts of climate change, as well as communicating widely to share information on gender responsive climate action. Now, just to summarize all of that, In all of our COP26 work, we are really committed to amplifying women's voices in COP26 work and ensuring women and girls, particularly the most marginalised, can lead our work to build resilience and tackle emissions. And we will support the meaningful participation and representation of women at COP26 and champion women's climate leadership at local, national and global levels, recognising the critical role of women's rights and women's-led organisations in this, and also recognising what Bridget and Hindou have said about not just recognising, but also incorporating into action and leadership. And we really do welcome your ideas on how we can best deliver an inclusive COP, and in particular, how we can best bring in the voices and views of those most marginalised. And please do come speak to me if you think you have solutions that can help us. I really do mean it when I say we need broad perspectives to make COP26 a success. I'm really looking forward to all the questions and ongoing discussions about this. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Salka. And I think you've not only demonstrated the importance of diversity, but also the benefit that it brings to the table, which we know, but we need to make sure everyone knows also. Okay, so we've got lots of questions coming in, which is why I'm looking away from the screen a lot, just trying to make sure I capture all of them. But perhaps I can first ask Hannah from CARE to ask the first question via video. Is that okay?
Hi, I guess, yeah, it'll be me. Hi, I'm Francesca from
sorry, Francesca.
No worries. So my question would be around climate finance and other sources of funding that are available, and how can those be better used and diverted to support this diverse women's leadership that we want to see at all levels? And particularly, what do we want to see in terms of this issue in the run-up to COP26 this year?
Salka, perhaps you can kick us off with a response to that?
Yeah, I can kick us off. Happy to. And thanks for that question, Francesca. I mean, there's a huge amount more to be done on gender and finance. And from the UK side, we're working with people like ActionAid and to think about how we can do better. And the Gender Action Plan also really recognises this. And there are many ways to achieve this, whether with minimum standards or percentage targets or by tackling access to finance so it's more accessible to grassroots organisations. But I would really welcome hearing from other panellists what they think the priorities are and how we can think about them in planning and work together to make them a reality. So welcome hearing from others.
Yes, I'm happy for Bridget, Hindou, Mira. Bridget, maybe this is along the work you're already doing, I guess.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in and pass to my colleagues as well. We have certainly been working at the intersection of gender equality and climate finance, as well as from a feminist perspective. And it's kind of based on this overall premise that we've done a lot of work over the last few years to see how local women's organizations, grassroots group, and Indigenous women can gain access to the current climate finance that exists, as well as to make sure that each of the climate finance mechanisms themselves have gender action plans. And there's been a lot of achievement there with these broad-based plans existing across all climate financing mechanisms that exist right now. But fundamentally, the current mechanisms are just not fit for purpose for delivering finance directly to grassroots women's organizations, feminist groups, and communities. And so I think that there's two parts to this that we've been talking with lots of different governments about, with the Canadian government, hopefully in discussion with the UK COP Presidency, maybe even with the US government coming up as well. How do we change the delivery mechanisms of climate finance? So how do we orient large sums of climate finance, yes, to funds like the GCF and the Adaptation Fund, who do have donor and recipient countries equally involved in the board membership, who are bypassing in many ways the traditional MDB delivery mechanisms of funding, which really just inhibit access. And how do we take from examples of where there are new and innovative mechanisms of delivering finance directly to feminist organizations? One example, the government of the Netherlands has developed a large-scale Power of Voices, Power of Women initiative. They funded a collective called the GAGA, the Global Alliance for Green and Gender Action, which is led by a Southern feminist organization and a Southern feminist led collective. And we're talking, in the tune of millions, 20 to 40 million investment over the course of 5 years, which even by the standard of climate finance is small, but there's usually not a lot of delivery mechanisms which get the millions of sums directly into the hands of feminist organizations. So we need to be building off of models like that, like the newly launched Equality Fund, to see where we could be working in a much more innovative way. And then I think the second thing is that we need our partners in these mechanisms to recognize the fundamental premise of these mechanisms not being fit for purpose and actually challenge some longstanding norms, such as what do we understand about risk? We've seen a lot of GCF projects go forward where people, countries were asking for 11 million or so to retrofit a dam that had a certain level of a low risk indicator because, it's an infrastructure-based project, whereas we saw months and months of debate about investing in a community-based project in Bangladesh that was going to invest in women's livelihoods because that's seen as a greater risk in terms of whether or not will actually contribute to climate mitigation. So there's a need just in basic normative understandings of what risk looks like to really reframe that and to understand issues in the terms of diversity of scale. I think this is one of my biggest pleas is that, often in this space, the things that get, whether it's in the big climate pledge summits, et cetera, it's what's the biggest action that's gonna reduce the most greenhouse gas emissions. And there's very little attention paid to investment in small scale agroecology projects that have the potential to really transform communities if they were invested in and replicated en masse. And so that really reframing our thinking, I think, is a critical point here.
Thank you so much, Bridget. And Hindou, if you don't mind, what I'm going to do is I'm going to come to you with my next set of questions first, actually, because what I'm hearing is that the frame needs to change, right? And Hindou, when you spoke to us about patriarchy and how that impacts, decision making. And then a question on the chat from Selby Zuma around, how do we know that there is pervasive and entrenched gender inequality across the globe. So how do we tackle some of that? And I know, Hindou, you gave us an example, but maybe you can speak to us also around leadership and intersectional feminist leadership. And I'll come to you first, and then Mira, perhaps I can come to you to help me think through some of the questions that we've had around, what feminist leadership looks like today and where we can take it. Yeah. So Hindou, to you first.
Yeah, thank you, Faeeza, and thank you all for your questions. I think it's very important to emphasize the women leadership and then to give the women the place that they deserve. And that could be at the negotiation level and also at the implementation level. I can say at the negotiation level, it is very important to see how many people's being in the real room of the negotiations, because we are not talking about the plenary where everyone can come and sit down and just to listen and maybe the choosing delegate that can take the floor and speak. I'm talking about what Mera said earlier, there are the decision meetings who are called informal, informal, and you have informal. So 3. So why they call them informal? Because they want to just to get the place to have it excluded and discuss among themselves. They do informal because it can be used without the UNFCCC leadership, and that they can avoid interpretation. They can avoid putting it in the screen, and then just so they send via messages or via phone call and say like, oh, we are going to have meeting discussion in this one. Do you want to come? And informal, it is the same way, just to like they call the selected people to come there. And when we see all those groups, how many women are there? And how many representation even from developed and developing countries? And how many, peoples that speak the same language that can be in the room. So there are different level of inequality, different level of exclusions of the negotiations in the peoples. So they must just tackle this one first and say we need the transparency. And we all know we have to implement the Paris agreements, and what we decide good on it, transparency, openness, and inclusiveness. So it needs to be open, inclusive, and transparent, and women need to be there. This is the first beginning of giving the leadership of women to be there. And secondly, the negotiations, of course, now we are seeing some countries giving like women or taking women in the delegations. But it is not just like I have 5 delegates and I have 2 women, and that means like, okay, I'm the top and I'm the best. No, it means that is it those women taking the decisions? When they come, are they have to take them phone and call you about each single negotiation before that they agree and say just like, yes, we agree on it? Those women need to come with the mandate of them countries, of them delegations, and sit down and take the decision without being criticized. Because at the end of the day, we have to see that we are a human being and we are not coming then to negotiate because of the money or because of the whatever market. We are coming to negotiate because of our present and our future. And women know that better because they are the family leaders. They are the ones who are making sure that children eat it. And then the man and the woman eating, and then the elders are safe. So this leadership in the mind of the woman are much bigger than in the mind of the man. Excuse me if they are man in this one. I have a father, I have a husband, but it is the reality. Women have a long-term vision. So that's why we need to give this leadership there. And at the local level, it is very important also about how we can do it. We need also to go beyond our patriarchal issues. We are talking about environment. We are talking about climate. We are talking about our food, our water, our air that we are breathing. We are talking about our land, our legacy that we wanted to give to our children. So we have to think beyond of all the political or all the power things. And that can help the woman to be there and be seen equal. And that's what we are asking in the negotiation, like at the UNFCCC, Salka talked about it, the facilitative working group. What we did, we say as indigenous peoples, we wanted to have gender as one of the criteria. So if we are going to have 4 peoples, it must be 2 women and 2 men. It doesn't matter from the color or from the country or from whatever. It matters for us that women come and talk for themselves. And we put that as criteria. Who respect it? Indigenous people respect it 100% and more. Who didn't respect it? From the government as usual. So how we can go and then say, you wanted to have a text to call it procedures and rule. You must be the first one who will respect it. So we wanted them to respect it. And that is today.
I'm really sorry. I don't want to stop you because I could listen to you all day.
Must go to COP Presidency to see. They wanted to make it real. They must implement what already happened into consideration.
I'm completely with you. And I'm sorry. I'm so sorry to interrupt you. I'm going to go to Mira next, and I know you're going to pick up on some of the points, Mira, but I just want, there's a question from Deborah on the chat around, Hindou's already touched on this. We don't just want women there for the sake of being tick box. They need to be there. They need to be there in positions of real power with the mandate to make decisions. She's demonstrated why. But the question from Deborah is really around a tactic, I guess, to put in certain women of, with particular views, particularly more, she describes it as conservative views, and almost that this has been used as a tool to say we're participating, but it actually doesn't bring about change because they're not putting forward the agendas we're speaking about.
Yeah, no, great question. Thank you. And yeah, I completely agree with what Hindou is saying. So it's not about tokenism. So if you're just putting women on the delegation just because there's a quota you need to fill and they don't have the mandate, or even that they are coming with an agenda, a particular agenda, to answer Deborah's question, it really depends on what the country's own agenda is. So for a country like Brazil, which is enforcing really, really, I'm going to use the word fascist policies in the country, there's no doubt that they would have similar tactics of bringing in voices that are more damaging to the negotiations and to the cause of climate justice themselves. So if we talk about feminist leadership is actually about the values that feminism brings into these conversations, the intersectional approach. So you analyze things from an intersectional perspective. And then because of that perspective, you automatically then have the right people in the room to have these conversations with, to take decisions that take into account the diversity in voices, the diversity in the causes, because climate justice is racial justice, is disability justice, is queer justice, is land justice. So you can't divorce climate justice from all these interconnected struggles. Like Audre Lorde says, there's no single issue struggle. All struggles are interconnected, and so therefore there are no single issue lives. So feminist leadership is not just about having representation. It's about ensuring that those values are practiced and lived in the spaces that we are within. And bringing these diversity of voices then leads to solutions that meet the challenges at the local level, that meet the needs. So that's why we also talk about, as Hindou was saying, ensuring that we don't just have women coming to the COPs and intersectionals, but also at the national level and local level, they're involved in decision making.
Thank you so much, Mira. And before you go, I've still got tons of questions to ask, but I know we're running out of time. So I want to ask you specifically for either girls and women with less opportunities, or just girls and women in the future, what one change would you like to see, or what one message would you like to give them?
I guess the message is to be who they want to be and believe in themselves. So I know that it's not just manifesting, that it's not just about believing who you are, but also having the opportunities. So my real suggestion would be, if I take a broader perspective, is to stand in your truth, but also to support others in their truth. Because without solidarity and without relationship building, without the network building, without the community building, we can't be the powerful voice that we need to be. So I'd say that you are the ones, to quote June Jordan, you are the ones who you have been waiting for. So don't wait for messiahs, don't wait for people from the top to give you the answers. You are the ones that you've been waiting for. You are the leaders, and you have the solutions for what transformation needs to happen at the societal level.
Thank you so much. Bridget, I'll come to you next. Either one change you'd like to see, or a message particularly for women and girls across the world on this issue.
Yeah, I think I echo what Mira has said. I wanted to leave, I guess, this call with I remain really, really hopeful and optimistic about where we are right now in terms of not just advances. I see a lot more women who are working for women's leadership and all their diversity are really thinking about not just participation, but power, and how do we build power. And I think that's the important crux of this, is really kind of diving into where power sits and the multiple levels of oppression, and breaking that down in an intersectional way. And I think paired with some really important movements towards feminist governance, both from countries who are announcing feminist foreign policies to those who are thinking about what diversity and inclusion looks like in their leadership. I think change can come from that, because it is, in fact, challenging power. So thank you to having me here today.
Thanks, Bridget. Okay, Salka, I'll come to you next, and then Hindou, I'll come. And if you can keep it, quite short, if you can.
I would say the main changes that I would like to see is really thinking about gender responsiveness for our policies and our actions. I feel like a lot of our policies and actions are created in a gender neutral manner, assuming they work for everyone, but they need to be designed by women for women to be able to take those bespoke solutions into account. So I do really want us to systematically rethink everything that we do, but I appreciate that doesn't happen overnight. So we need all of you to participate in doing that.
Thanks, Salka. And Hindou, to you finally.
I think all of them say what is the most important. I don't want to see women and girls to be a checking box or checking lists. I wanted them to be naturally in the place that they deserve. And they all deserve these places, so they might be confident and be there.
Thanks, Hindou. Okay, I could say so much. I'm like super excited. This discussion has been incredible. So I'm just going to say thank you to everyone. I have to also say thank you to the players of the People's Postcode Lottery who supported this event. Further information about the work of the organizing partners is available in the link that's being posted in the chat. I just want to, before I end and hand back over to Susie, to say, highlight the work that the Centenary Action Group is doing in the UK. We know that existing inequalities mean that women are going to be disproportionately impacted by the coronavirus outbreak, yet women have been largely invisible from the UK government's crisis decision-making table. We know that only 34% of MPs and just 35% of local councillors in England and Wales are women. And ultimately, what we want to do is work to create a movement for equal representation, like we've been saying, at every level of politics and public life. So do check out the partnership project. The Muslim Women's Network is also a partner of the Fawcett Society project called Equal Power. It's a 3-year campaign to really get more women in all of our diversities into politics at every level. And there's training, online free training at the moment available, so do check it out.